The first time I heard about the rain market, I was 24 years old and washing dishes for a living. That detail matters because if I'd had any other kind of job, I think I would have laughed it off and gone home and slept like a normal person. But people who work the closing shift in a kitchen know something about night that other people don't. They know that the world after 1 a.m. isn't the same world that runs during the day. It's quieter, but it's also looser, like a screw that's been backed off 2 turns. Things can slip through. I was working at a place called Mercer's, on the corner of Hadley and Vine, which doesn't matter except that it tells you what part of the city I mean, the east side. The old part, where the buildings still have those iron fire escapes, nobody trusts, and the streetlights are spaced too far apart, so you walk through pools of dark between them. Mercer's had been a steakhouse before it was a bistro, and a chop house before it was a steakhouse, and probably a butcher's before any of that. The grease in the hood vents had history. We closed the kitchen at 11 and the dining room at midnight, and by the time I'd hosed down the mats and scraped the flat top, it was usually 1:15 before I clocked out. I want to be honest about who I was then, because it explains why I went the first time. I was tired the way people in their 20s are tired, which is a kind of tired that hasn't yet learned to scare you. I drank too much coffee. I owed my mother $300. I had a girlfriend named Renata who was studying to be a court reporter and who had started, very politely, to suggest that I might want to think about doing something other than dishes. I lived in a studio above a tax preparer's office, and the radiator made a sound at night, like someone was trying to learn the harmonica through a wall. So when Petter, who washed dishes alongside me, told me about the market, I was in the right shape to listen. Petter was older than me, somewhere past 50, and he'd come from somewhere east of Berlin originally, although I never got the country exactly right, because every time I asked, he answered something different, and I think it amused him that I couldn't pin him down. Petter smoked rolled cigarettes in the alley between courses, and he told me, one rainy Tuesday, near the end of October, about a market that only opened when it rained. He didn't tell me like it was a secret. He told me like it was a piece of city information, the way you might mention that a certain bus stops running after 11, or that the laundromat on 8th Street takes only quarters. He said there was a place on the lower end of Cobalt Street, down near the canal, that opened up under the old produce arcade when it was raining hard enough to keep most people indoors. He said you could buy things there you couldn't buy anywhere else. He said the prices were fair. He said the only rule was that you didn't look the customers in the eye. I asked him if he meant the sellers. He said no. He meant the customers, the other people shopping. You could look at the sellers all you wanted. You could look at the goods. You could look at the floor, the ceiling, your own hands. You just didn't look at the other people who were there to buy. I asked him why. He took a long pull on his cigarette and watched the rain skim across the puddle in the alley, and he said, in the tone of a man who has already decided he's said enough, because then you become a customer too. I didn't understand what that meant. I thought it was the kind of half-joke immigrants tell young Americans to see if they'll repeat it later and look stupid. Petter had a sense of humor like that, dry and unhurried, with long gaps between the joke and the laugh. So I filed it away. I thought about it once or twice over the next week, the way you think about an odd line from a movie. And then on the following Thursday, it rained. It didn't just rain. It came down the way it does in this city. Sometimes in late October, when the season is turning over and the river fog rolls up into the streets and meets the rain coming down, and the whole place fills with a low gray water that gets into your collar, no matter what kind of coat you're wearing. I closed the kitchen at 11:15 because we'd had no customers for the last hour, and I walked out into Hadley Street with my hood up and my sneakers already soaked through. And instead of turning right toward my apartment, I turned left. I want to say I went on a whim, but that isn't true. I'd been thinking about it all week. I'd been thinking about it through every shift. I'd been waiting for it to rain. Cobalt Street runs along the east side of the canal, and the produce arcade Petter had mentioned was 3 blocks south of the bridge. I'd walked past it 100 times without ever really looking at it. It was one of those long, low brick buildings with a corrugated metal roof, the kind that had probably handled wholesale fruit in the 40s and then gradually emptied out as the city's distribution moved north. Most of its bays were boarded up. There was a faded sign that still said Worsham and Sons in white letters on a green ground, and a smaller sign underneath, hand-painted, that said no loitering in a font that suggested the loiterers had stopped caring decades ago. The thing I remember most about that first walk down Cobalt is how quiet it was. Even the rain was quiet. It was falling steadily but without wind, and it made a soft, even hiss against the metal roof of the arcade, and I could hear my own footsteps on the wet brick, and that was about it. No traffic. No voices. The streetlights along the canal were the old sodium kind, and they made the rain look orange where it fell through them. I didn't see the market at first. I walked past the arcade once, all the way to the next bridge, and I thought, well, Petter was lying, or I'd misunderstood, and I turned around to go home. And on my way back, on the canal side of the building, I saw that one of the bays was open, not boarded, not chained, just open, with a roll-up door pushed all the way to the top, and a soft yellow light coming out of it onto the wet brick. I want you to understand that this opening had not been there 10 minutes earlier. I had walked directly past that bay. I had looked at it. It had been a wall. Now it was a doorway, and inside the doorway I could see what looked like a long aisle of stalls receding into the building, lit by strings of bare bulbs, and I could hear, faintly, the sound of voices, not loud, conversational, the murmur a market makes. I stood on the wet brick for what must have been a full minute. The rain ran off my hood and down the front of my coat. I thought about Petter's face when he'd told me. I thought about the way he had not been joking, exactly, but had not been entirely serious either. The way a man might warn you about a dog that probably won't bite. And I stepped inside. The first thing I noticed was the smell. It was the smell of a real market, the kind I remembered from when my grandmother used to take me to the farmer's co-op when I was little. Cardboard, damp wool, old produce, kerosene, bread. It was a layered, lived-in smell, and it didn't match the building at all. The building should have smelled like rust and pigeon. This smelled like commerce. The second thing I noticed was that the aisle went much further back than the building should have allowed. I could see the canal side wall of the arcade from the outside. I knew roughly how deep the building was. The aisle in front of me was at least 3 times that. It receded into a yellow haze of bulb light, and I couldn't see the back of it. The third thing I noticed was the people. There were maybe 20 other shoppers in the aisle, moving slowly between stalls, and every single one of them had their hood up or a hat pulled low or a scarf wrapped around the lower half of their face. None of them looked at me. None of them looked at each other. They moved past one another with the careful, practiced courtesy of people on a crowded subway platform, eyes down, shoulders angled slightly away. And I remembered what Petter had said, and I felt the back of my neck get cold under my wet hood, because I understood, suddenly and without anyone explaining it to me, that this was a real rule and not a joke. I kept my eyes on the floor. The floor was old brick, swept clean, and there were narrow strips of cardboard laid down in places where the brick was uneven. I watched my own sneakers move forward over the cardboard, and I let my peripheral vision do the rest. The stalls on either side of me were the kind of folding tables you see at street fairs, draped with cloth, lit by the bulbs strung overhead. The sellers stood behind them, and Petter had been right about the sellers. You could look at the sellers all you wanted. I let myself look at the first one. It was a woman, somewhere between 40 and 70. It was hard to tell, with her gray hair pulled back into a bun and a wool cardigan buttoned all the way to the throat. She was selling spools of thread, just spools of thread, in colors I'd never seen before. They were arranged on the table in neat rows, and the colors didn't quite hold still when I looked at them directly. A spool I would have called dark green slid sideways into something more like the color of a bruise the longer I watched it. The woman caught my eye and smiled at me, a small, polite, transactional smile, the kind a shopkeeper gives a stranger. I smiled back and kept walking. The next stall was a man selling old radios. They were the heavy kind, wood cabinet radios from the 30s and 40s, and they were all on, very softly, and each one was tuned to a different station, and the sum of their voices made a kind of low, comforting murmur, like a crowd at a distant party. I leaned closer to one of them and heard a woman's voice reading a list of names. I couldn't make out the names. I straightened up and moved on. The third stall sold candles. The fourth sold what looked like fountain pens, but with nibs I didn't recognize. The fifth sold jars of honey, and the honey in the jars was dark, almost black, and it caught the bulb light strangely, the way old motor oil does. I stopped at the honey stall because I liked honey, and because the seller, an older man with a closely trimmed beard, looked at me the way an ordinary grocer looks at an ordinary customer. "First time?" he said. I nodded. "Don't buy anything yet," he said, very quietly. "Walk through. See what's here. If something wants you, you'll know." I asked him what he meant by that. He smiled, not unkindly, and said, "You'll know. I want to record, here, that he was the one who told me about the rule out loud. He didn't say it as an instruction. He said it as a reminder, like a teacher reminding a child not to run in the hallway. He said, "And keep your eyes off the other shoppers. That's the only thing we ask." I asked him why. He looked at me for a long moment, and his face changed, very slightly, not into something frightening, into something tired, too. He said, "Because some of them aren't shopping, some of them are being shopped for, and if you look at one of those, the seller doesn't always know which of you to wrap up." I didn't understand him. I thought I did, in the moment, but looking back, I don't think I did at all. I nodded as though I understood, and I moved on. I walked the aisle for what felt like 20 minutes, and the aisle kept being longer than it should have been. I passed a stall that sold sheet music, and a stall that sold what looked like dental tools laid out on velvet, and a stall that sold bird cages with nothing in them, but the bars were made of something that wasn't quite metal. I passed a stall that sold framed photographs of strangers, and a stall that sold buttons in glass jars, and a stall that sold what the seller called weather, in small corked bottles, each labeled with a date and a place. I picked up a bottle labeled April 7, 1962 KUW Gardens, and the seller, a young woman with a long braid, told me very gently that I shouldn't open it indoors. The other shoppers moved around me like fish in a current. I never looked at their faces. I got very good, in those 20 minutes, at watching only their hands. People's hands tell you a lot when you're paying attention. Some of the hands at the rain market were ordinary. Chapped knuckles, wedding rings, the kind of hands you see on a bus. But some of them weren't. I saw a hand that had too many knuckles in each finger, not too many fingers, but too many joints, so that when the hand picked up a candle, it folded around it in a way no human hand should fold. I saw a pair of hands wearing white cotton gloves that were stained dark at the fingertips, and the stain was wet. I saw a hand that didn't quite touch the table when it reached for something, that hovered a quarter-inch above the cloth, and the object it picked up rose to meet it. I kept my eyes on my own sneakers after that. I don't remember deciding to buy anything. I remember stopping at a stall near the back of the aisle, where the bulbs were dimmer and the air was colder. And I remember the seller was a woman in a long dark coat, and the table in front of her was bare, except for a small wooden box. The box was about the size of a deck of cards. It was unvarnished pine, and it had a little brass hook-and-eye latch on the front. I asked her what was in it. She said, "A quiet evening." I asked her what that meant. She said, "Exactly what it sounds like. You open it when you need one." I asked her how much. She looked at me, and I want to say that her eyes were unkind, but they weren't. They were only patient. She said, 3 memories. Small ones. Nothing you'll miss tomorrow. I'll take them at the door on your way out. I laughed. I genuinely laughed, because it was the kind of thing you'd hear in a story, and because I was nervous, and because I wanted, suddenly and stupidly, to prove that I was the kind of person who could joke around in a place like this. I said, "What if I don't have any to spare?" "1." She said, "Everyone has small ones to spare. That's why they're small." I said I'd think about it. She nodded as though she'd expected that, and I moved on. The aisle ended, eventually, at a back wall that was hung with a heavy canvas curtain. I didn't go through it. I don't know what was behind it. I turned around and walked back the way I had come, and the walk back felt shorter than the walk in, the way walks back often do, but also in a way that wasn't quite right, because by my count I passed only half the stalls I'd passed on the way in. The stall with the weather in bottles was gone. The stall with the radios was gone. The stall with the buttons was still there, and so was the honey man, and he nodded to me as I passed. I got to the open bay door, and I stepped out into the rain, and the rain hit my face, and it was real rain, cold and ordinary, and the brick under my feet was wet and ordinary. And behind me, the bay door was already lower than it had been when I came in, sliding down slowly on its own, and the yellow light inside was narrowing to a slit. I walked home along the canal. I didn't run. I think if I'd run, I wouldn't have made it. I think the running would have changed something. I walked, with my hood up, and I kept my eyes on the wet pavement, and I didn't look at any of the people I passed on the street, even though there were very few of them at that hour, and none of them, as far as I could tell, were paying me any attention. When I got back to my apartment, I took off my coat and hung it on the radiator, and I sat on the edge of my bed for a long time without turning on the lights. I tried to remember what I had seen, in order, from the beginning. I could remember most of it. I could remember the threads, and the radios, and the honey, and the pine box, and the woman in the long coat. But there were 3 small holes in my evening. 3 things I knew I should have remembered and didn't. I knew I'd had lunch that day. I couldn't remember what it had been. I knew there was a song my mother used to sing to me when I was very small. I couldn't remember the tune. I knew the name of the cat I'd had when I was 9. I couldn't remember it. These were small things. They were exactly as small as the woman had said they would be. And on the table by my bed, where I was sure I had not put it, was the pine box with the brass hook and eye latch. I didn't open it that night. I didn't open it the next night either. I put it in the drawer of my nightstand, under a pile of unopened mail, and I tried to forget about it. And for a few weeks I almost succeeded, because the weather turned dry and cold and there was no rain at all in the city for almost 3 weeks. And during those 3 weeks I told myself a number of comforting things. I told myself I had been overtired. I told myself the place had been some kind of weird underground flea market, and I had just imagined the strangeness because of how late it was and how soaked I had been. I told myself the missing memories were the kind of things people forget anyway, and the pine box was a souvenir I'd picked up and forgotten paying for. I almost believed all of it. I might have managed to believe all of it, eventually, if Petter hadn't asked me, one slow afternoon at the sink, whether I'd gone. I told him I had. He looked at me carefully. He asked me what I'd bought. I told him about the box. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Did you open it?" I said no. He said, "Don't open it inside. If you open it, do it outside, in a field, somewhere with sky. And don't open it at night." I asked him why. He didn't answer. He went back to scrubbing a sauté pan. After a while, without looking up, he said, "And don't go back." I said I hadn't planned on it. He said, "You will. Everyone goes back. The first one is free. The second one is the one you pay for." I asked him what he meant by that. I asked him whether he had gone back. I asked him what he had bought the first time and what he had bought the second. He didn't answer any of those questions. He finished the pan and racked it and went out into the alley to smoke. And when he came back, the conversation was over, in the way that some conversations are over for good. The next time it rained was the second week of November, and I lasted exactly 2 hours after my shift ended before I put my coat on and walked back down to Cobalt Street. I want to be honest about why I went back, because I've thought about it a lot in the years since, and I don't think it was curiosity, exactly, although that's what I told myself at the time. I think it was that the missing pieces of my memory had started to itch. I would reach for them, sometimes, the way you reach for a tooth that's gone, and the absence had a shape, and the shape bothered me. I wanted to know if I could get them back. I thought, in the simple way you think when you're 24, that if I had bought them I could buy them back. The bay door was open again. The yellow light was the same. The smell, when I stepped inside, was the same. Cardboard, wool, kerosene, bread. The aisle stretched away into the haze, and the other shoppers moved through it with their faces turned down and away. And I kept my eyes on my sneakers and the cardboard and the swept brick, and I walked. I was looking for the woman in the long coat. I had a small speech prepared. I was going to ask her, politely, if there was any way to undo the transaction. I was going to offer her something else in exchange. I had a watch that had belonged to my grandfather, and I had brought it in my pocket. I thought I could offer her the watch. I didn't find her. I walked the entire aisle, all the way to the canvas curtain at the back, and the stall where she had been was occupied by a man selling keys. Just keys, hundreds of them, hung on pegs and laid out on the table, every shape and size, some of them rusted and some of them gleaming, and the man behind the table was watching me with a polite, professional patience. I asked him where the woman in the long coat had gone. He said, "She isn't here tonight. Different sellers, different rains." I asked him whether she would be back. He said, "Eventually. The rains come around." I asked him whether anyone could undo a sale. He looked at me for a long time. He said, "That depends on what you bought and what you've done with it since." I told him about the box. He nodded slowly and he said, "You haven't opened it." I said, "No." I said, "No." He said, "Then you've still got something to trade. If you open it, you don't. The opening is what fixes the price." I asked him what he meant. He said, "Right now, the box is potential. It hasn't been used. If you bring it back unopened, she might take it back and give you back what you traded. Maybe not all of it, maybe most. But once you open it, the quiet evening goes into the world, and there's nothing to return. The trade is closed." I asked him whether I could trade with him instead. He smiled, and his smile was the first thing in the market that I would call unkind. He said, "I deal in keys. Do you have a door?" I said I didn't understand. He said, "Then you don't have anything I want." I left his stall and I walked back toward the entrance, and on the way back, I made the mistake. I want to be careful about how I describe it. because I've gone over it many times in my head, and I'm still not entirely sure how it happened. I think a draft moved through the aisle. I think one of the bulbs overhead flickered. I think I heard, very faintly, someone say my name. I looked up. I didn't mean to. I looked up the way you look up when someone calls you in a crowd, automatic, before your conscious mind has caught up, and I looked directly into the face of another shopper. She was standing maybe 4 feet away from me, between 2 stalls, in a long gray coat with the hood pushed back, and her hair was wet, and she was looking at me. I want to tell you that her face was monstrous. I want to tell you that she had too many eyes, or no mouth, or skin that moved like water. But she didn't. Her face was entirely ordinary. She looked like someone I might have gone to high school with. She had brown eyes and a small scar on her upper lip, and the kind of tired expression people have at the end of a long day. She was looking at me with a recognition that was patient and personal and absolutely certain, and I understood, in the way you sometimes understand things in dreams, that she had been waiting for me to look up. Not for hours, for a long time, longer than I had been alive. She smiled. It was a small, polite smile. It was the smile of a person who has been kept waiting and is being gracious about it. And then she lifted her hand, very slightly, and made a small gesture I can only describe as a beckoning, a curl of 2 fingers, the way you might call a child closer. I didn't move. Behind me, very quietly, the man with the keys said, "Walk, don't run, eyes down, now." I dropped my eyes to my sneakers. I started walking. I could feel her looking at me. I could feel her watching the top of my hood as I moved. I walked past stalls I didn't see and sellers I didn't acknowledge, and the aisle felt longer going out than it had going in, and at one point I was sure I heard footsteps behind me, soft and unhurried, keeping perfect pace with mine. I made it to the bay door. I stepped out into the rain. The brick under my feet was slick and ordinary, and the rain hit my face and ran into my mouth, and I kept walking, and I did not look back, and I did not run. The footsteps behind me stopped at the threshold of the bay. I'm fairly sure, I never looked to confirm. I walked all the way home along the canal in a daze. When I got to my apartment, I locked the door behind me, which was something I almost never did, and I sat on the floor with my back against the door for a while, and I tried to slow my breathing. The pine box was in the drawer of my nightstand. I could feel it from across the room, the way you can feel a tooth. I did not sleep that night. In the morning, I called Petter. He answered on the 4th ring, and I told him what had happened. And there was a long silence on the line, and then he said, "Did she gesture to you?" I said yes. He said, "Then you have to leave the city." I laughed. I thought he was joking. He said, "I'm not joking. Listen to me. You looked at her. She gestured. That's the beginning of a transaction. You haven't agreed to it, but you've been offered. As long as you stay in this city, every time it rains, the offer is open, and every time it rains, the offer gets a little easier to accept." I asked him what would happen if I accepted. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, "You'd become a customer, and the next person who came down Cobalt Street on a wet night, looking for something interesting, would see you in the aisle, and they would try not to look at you, and most of them wouldn't, and the ones who did would be in the same trouble you're in now." I asked him how he knew all of this. He said, "Because I looked, once, a long time ago, in a different city, and I didn't leave fast enough." I asked him what had happened. He said, "Nothing yet. I never opened what I bought. I never went back a 3rd time. I keep moving. I'm still here. That's the deal I made with myself. As long as I keep moving, the offer can't quite find me." I asked him whether I should open the box. He said, "No, Bring the box with you when you leave. Don't open it in the city. Don't open it in any city. If you ever open it, do it in a place with no roof and no walls, in the daytime, and walk away from it after. Don't look back at it. Don't ever come back to that spot. I asked him whether the woman could follow me out of the city. He said, I don't think so. I think she's tied to the rain there, to that arcade, to Cobalt Street. But I'm not certain. Nobody's certain. We're all just guessing. He hung up. I left the city 11 days later. I told Renata I had a family emergency. I told my landlord I had to move home. I told Mercer's I was quitting, and the manager didn't even look up from his clipboard because dishwashers come and go. I packed everything I owned into 2 duffel bags and a milk crate, and I took a bus south to a town where my aunt lived, and I stayed with her for a month while I figured out what to do. I had the pine box with me the whole time. I kept it in the bottom of one of the duffel bags, wrapped in a t-shirt. I never opened it. It rained twice during that month in my aunt's town, and both times I felt something that I can only describe as a tug, very faint. The way you feel the pull of a thread caught on something behind you when you walk, it wasn't strong. It didn't draw me anywhere, but it was there, and it was directional, and it pointed north and east, back toward the city I had left. I learned, over the following years, to live with the tug. It got fainter as the months passed, and fainter still as the years did. I moved further south, eventually, to a place near the coast where the rain comes in heavy bands off the Gulf and is over fast and doesn't linger. I got married. I didn't marry Renata. We drifted apart in the way people do when one of them has had something happen that they can't explain. I married a woman named Helene who works for the county, and we have a daughter now who is 9 years old, and I have not been back to that city in 17 years. I never opened the pine box. I thought about it many times. There were nights, especially in the early years, when I would take it out of the drawer where I kept it, and I would sit with it on my knees, and I would run my thumb over the brass hook and eye latch, and I would think about what a quiet evening might be like. My life, in those years, was not quiet. I worked 2 jobs. I had a child who didn't sleep. I had bills I couldn't always pay. The idea of opening a small wooden box and stepping into a quiet evening was, some nights, almost more than I could resist. But I always thought about Petter, and about the man with the keys, and about the woman in the gray coat who had been waiting for me. And I always put the box back in the drawer. Last spring, I drove out to the desert. I didn't tell Helene exactly why. I told her I needed a weekend to clear my head. She's good about that kind of thing. She doesn't ask questions she senses I can't answer. I drove west for 2 days, until I got to a stretch of country where the sky is bigger than the land, and I pulled off the highway onto a dirt road and drove down it until I couldn't see the highway anymore. And I got out of the car with the pine box in my hand. It was the middle of the afternoon. The sun was high and white. There were no clouds. There was no rain anywhere within 500 miles. I walked out into the scrub, maybe 100 yards from the car, and I set the pine box on a flat rock, and I undid the brass hook and eye latch, and I opened the lid. Nothing came out. Nothing visible, anyway. There was no sound. There was no smoke. The box was empty inside, lined with what looked like very old velvet, the color of wine. I stood there for a long moment, and I felt, very briefly, something that I think was what she had been selling. It was a feeling of profound stillness, of a long evening with nothing to do and nowhere to be and no one expecting anything of me. It was beautiful, in the way a photograph of a place you've never been can be beautiful. It lasted maybe 4 seconds, and then it was gone, dispersed into the dry desert air, and the box was just a box, and the rock was just a rock, and the sun was just the sun. I left the box on the rock. I walked back to the car. I did not look back. I drove home. I have not felt the tug since. I want to tell you that this is the end of the story, but it isn't, quite. I want to tell you that I closed the loop, that I disposed of the thing I bought, that the trade is finished. I almost believe it. Most days I do. But there are still small holes in my memory. 3 of them, exactly the shape of what I traded. I still don't know what I had for lunch on the day I first walked into that market. I still don't know the tune my mother used to sing. I still don't know the name of the cat I had when I was 9, although my mother has told me the name 3 or 4 times over the years, and each time I write it down, and each time, within a day or 2, the writing is still there, but the name behind it has gone again, like water poured into sand. And once in a while, when it rains here, which isn't often, I find myself standing at the kitchen window, looking out at the yard. And I find that I have been standing there for longer than I meant to. And I find that I have been listening, without meaning to, for the sound of footsteps on wet brick. They never come. Of course they never come. I'm 1,000 miles from Cobalt Street, and I'm a grown man with a family and a mortgage and a daughter who needs help with her homework. And the woman in the gray coat is, at most, a memory of a face I shouldn't have looked at, on a night I shouldn't have been out in. But I'll tell you this, and then I'll be done. Last month, my daughter came home from school with a drawing she'd made in art class. It was a picture of our house, done in colored pencil, with our family standing in the front yard. Helene and me and her, all holding hands. She'd drawn herself in the middle, with her hair in 2 braids, the way she wears it. She'd drawn Helene on the right, in the green dress she wears on weekends. She'd drawn me on the left, in my work jacket. And behind us, in the doorway of the house, half hidden by the doorframe, she had drawn a 4th figure. A woman in a long gray coat, with her hood pushed back, and a small, polite smile, and one hand raised in what might have been a wave and might have been a beckoning. I asked my daughter, as casually as I could, who the woman in the doorway was. She looked at the drawing for a moment, the way children do when they're trying to remember something they knew clearly an hour ago. And then she shrugged, and she said, "I don't know. She's been in a couple of my drawings. I think she's waiting for someone." I asked her if the woman had ever said anything. My daughter thought about it. Then she said, "She told me once that she was a friend of yours. From before. She said you'd know what she meant. Everything." I told my daughter that the woman wasn't a friend of mine, and that if she ever saw the woman again, in a drawing or anywhere else, she should keep her eyes down and not look at her face. My daughter looked at me strangely, the way she does when she suspects I'm being weird about something for adult reasons. And she said, "Okay," and she went to do her homework. I took the drawing into the garage, and I put it in a metal coffee can, and I burned it, and I buried the ash in the corner of the yard. It hasn't rained here in 3 weeks. The forecast says it might, this weekend. I've been watching the sky. I keep telling myself that the trade is closed, that the box is empty in the desert, that she can't follow water she doesn't have, that my daughter has an active imagination and draws strange things sometimes, and that's all it is. But I keep my eyes down when I walk past windows now, and I've started, without quite meaning to, teaching my daughter to do the same, just in case the rain, when it finally comes, brings someone who's been waiting a very long time to be looked at again.